Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look at installing the Redarc brake controller on a 2017 Cadillac Escalade. Now there's two different configurations of the Redarc brake controller available, and it's really going to be dependent on how many axles your trailer has that you plan on towing. If you have 1 to 2 axles, you're going to want to go with the Tow Pro Liberty. Now if you have 3 axles, you're going to want to step that up to the Tow Pro Elite. I think the best part about the Redarc brake controller, and I recommend it to a lot of people because it has such a small real estate here. You get all the same functions of a normal brake controller, and you may say, well, it doesn't have a screen like one. You don't really need that screen. You can still adjust your gain just by turning the knob here, and I have it plugged into our test box, so we're going to hear this buzz. As I do our manual slide here is just a simple push of a button, but as I apply it, you can see as the gain goes up, the color actually changes on the knob. So at 10, we have a bright red, and then as we go down a little bit lower, it actually goes to a cooler color. So that way you know right away when you're hitting the brakes on the vehicle, you'll be able to see where it's actually braking. So I put my brake pedal down, and you can see it's going to that brighter color wherever I set it. Now what's really nice too is you can swap between the two modes. You can have your user controlled mode, or you can just have the proportional mode. And what that means is I can set the gain to wherever I want according to my trailer, and it's going to apply the brakes at that pressure to what I set it to. But if I want to go to the proportional, where it's going to brake according to how much brake pressure I'm putting on the vehicle, that's easy. It's just a double tap on the button, and that's going to put it in that mode. And the G-force that's picked up by our module will adjust accordingly as we need more braking pressure. Now when choosing your brake controller, you have two options when it comes to the Redarc. You have your Liberty, which is going to be from 1 to 2 axles, and then if you move up to the Elite, you're going to be able to go up to 3 axles. So that's the main difference. They're going to install exactly the same. Now speaking of that installation, let's take a look. That way you can get it installed in your Escalade. Now to begin our installation, we are going to be needing to pull off some panels to be able to mount up our Redarc. And the first way to actually gain access to where we're going to mount it is by pulling off this side panel. Now with this kind of leather covering, it is kind of soft touch. You want to be careful to not scratch it or cut it. So I'm using a plastic trim tool, and it's just a series of clips here. So if you can kind of wedge under here to get the first couple clips, you can kind of work your way around the edge, and you should be able to get this off fairly easily. These plastic clips can break, so you want to just pull straight out if you can and just take your time. Once you get them all pulled out, we should be able to kind of slide this out. And this is going to give us access to the Torx bits that are going to be right here. There's 2 of them. There's also going to be 2 underneath, so we'll go ahead and get those taken out. Now ultimately, we're going to be mounting it right in this little corner here. It's kind of part of the center cluster panel, so we'll be needing to pull the panel out underneath it to be able to kind of get up in here and double check to make sure that we have clearance. Now to get these out, you're going to use a T15 Torx bit. So we'll get these 2, and then if you feel on the bottom, there's going to be one right here, as well as one kind of right on about an inch over from the hood release latch. So just go ahead and get all 4 of those taken out. Now at this point, we are going to need to pull our panel back. We have our screws taken out. There is a little tab. We'll just pry this back, and then we're going to pull this straight back kind of towards us here. There's going to be a series of clips, so we're going to just work our way, putting pressure on the clips, just pry back, and again, pull towards yourself. And then once we kind of get these, we can kind of work our way down, and we should be able to get this whole panel off. Now just kind of take your time here. You don't want to damage these clips. Now be careful not to pull this out too far, as we do need to separate the wiring here. So there is a clip we're just going to press in here, and we should be able to get this to pop out. And that way we have access to be able to have our panel taken out and more room to put our brake controller in. Now we need to find a spot to mount our brake controller, and the main thing is making sure we have clearance behind there. We want to make sure that's easily accessible while driving, and also a nice solid surface that's not too thick. And the controller is relatively long, so you want to make sure clearance-wise you have a straight shot back. So I think this is going to be a good spot. We can put our knob here, and it'll be easily accessible while driving, and reaching back there, I know that I don't have any issues fitting this plug. Now, as far as placement goes, it does start to kind of bow out, and we want this to sit in this flat location. That way it's not going to hit that or sit crooked. So kind of find that center point right about here. And we're gonna go ahead and drill this out with a 3/8 drill bit. So just take your time here. And you may have to enlarge it a little bit because we're going to be using this locking collar to hold the brake controller in place, but this puts it pretty good right here. Now there's also on the Liberty an LED light that we have to make a spot for, and the best way that I've found to really get a perfect spot for it is taking the collar, and you can flip it backwards here. We can put our locking collar in here, and this little notch and where the hole for the light is, we want that at the 12 o'clock position. And then I'm going to just take just a little punch here just to make our mark to where we're going to be drilling for that. And that's going to be an 1/8 inch drill bit. So having this little divot will make sure that we have it perfectly aligned. And you're going to want to make sure that any of this flashing is taken out because the collar has a kind of like a ridge that it sits in. So if you want it to sit flush, you do need to make sure that that sits in there. So you may have to enlarge the hole or just kind of clear that flashing out in order for it to sit perfectly flush, which is kind of crucial on these because there's only a small amount of thread. So you really need to get it as flat as possible. Otherwise you might have trouble kind of getting it to mount up. So I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of clean this out a little. Now we're going to be sliding this into place, and you can see the LED light here where it's going to go through that smaller hole that we drilled. But to make it easier to plug this in, we're going to go ahead and do that first. Now on the Liberty, you do have two options. You have one that's kind of a 90-degree for tight spots, which is kind of nice. And then we just have a straight cable. This one we have a pretty open shot. So I'm going to go ahead and just use the straight side here. It really doesn't matter if you have the clearance. And once we slide this up into place, have your locking collar and also that shroud ready. So we're gonna feed this up. And I will mention too, all that flashing, make sure that you get that cleared out really well. And then you can put that in place. And then our locking collar, we're just gonna go ahead and make sure it's nice and squared up. You don't wanna cross thread it here. And if you can get a few threads started by hand, that's great. If not, a 12mm socket, you can put it on there, and you're just going to want to hand tighten. You don't want to crack the collar here. So just enough to where it's snug and in place. And you should be able to kind of spin this dial as well as push it. If you're having any issues with that, you might want to take that collar out and try to re-thread it in. Make sure it's not cross-threaded, because times that I've had where it kind of starts to cross-thread, this is going to be tough to push, but this one's looking pretty solid here. So what I'll do is take our knob and turn it all the way counterclockwise, and that's going to put it at the 0, and that way we can get our knob in place, and that's going to be our reference point. So at this top little nodule right there by the light, we'll just take that 0, and we're going to just slide that on there. Now, regardless of whether you have the Elite or the Liberty like we have here today, it's going to plug in all the same. In fact, the box is going to look almost identical, except this one's red, the other one's black. But we have our connector here, which is going to go to our 90-degree on this one. And I'm going to plug this in. I still have the twist tie on this section because we're going to kind of keep this bundled up. And I'm not going to mount this up quite yet. We want to make sure that we have enough slack for our other plug. But we'll go ahead and snap this into place. And then we have our other custom fit cable, and this is going to tie into the tow package plug on this Escalade, so it makes it nice and easy. It's plug and play, and this end obviously goes into the braking module here. So we'll go ahead and get this snapped into place. And then I'm going to start making my way to where the factory plug is, which in this vehicle, it's actually located in a fuse box that's underneath the dash. Now this panel comes off pretty easily. There's going to be a large plastic tab that's tucked kind of right behind all these wires, but if you push in on that, that's going to release this side by the driver. And then the other two, you're going to have two tabs. You just push in on those, and they're going to be on the side here. Now once you get those popped in, you should be able to get this out. It is kind of a tight fit just because of the wire loom here, so just kind of work its way down until we get this out of the way. Now with this out of the way, we're going to see that we have the port for our plug-in. It's going to be right in this little slot up here, and you'll see that it's going to match up to the wire that we attached to our brake controller. So run your wire kind of clean until you get to that location, and the push button tab is going to face towards the driver's side door, so just kind of plug that in accordingly. Now that plug, you do have to give it a little bit of force, so don't be surprised if it doesn't just snap in. I kind of had to push it. Just make sure it's aligned properly. And before cleaning up all your panels and wiring, go ahead and give the button a push. You should see a nice blue glow, and that means that we have everything hooked up properly. Now getting the fuse cover back in place is going to be no problem because it's wide open up here, so when we plug that in, that cord should drape up. Now when routing it, you do want to kind of make sure that you're not going to get in anything as far as the steering wheel. You got to realize this does telescope, so we don't want to be able to pinch those wires. We also don't want to impede anything as far as the pedals, so just kind of route it clean and zip tie it up along the way. And as far as our module, we also need to get this mounted up as well with zip ties. Now you want to make sure that it's on a solid surface, something that's not going to move around. So a wire loom is not something you want to pick because what it's going to do is find its spot by having a solid mount, and once we start driving it'll calibrate it. But if it's going to be moving around, that could unfortunately make it to where it doesn't calibrate properly. So I'll get this all cleaned up and then show you how it looks. So I've gone ahead and zip tied everything up. The main thing is making sure that our actual brake controller, the red box, is going to be nice and secure. So definitely crank that down with those zip ties and try to give it a wiggle just to make sure it's not going to move. And then the rest of the wiring, I just kind of followed along and tucked it through some of the factory wiring as well as some of the factory just kind of parts underneath the dash just to kind of clean it up. And with that fuse cover back in place, and now all that's left to do is get everything else put back in as far as our interior panels, and make sure you plug in that parking brake when you get your panel back on. Now the great part about this system is you can really mount it any way that you need as long as it's secure. But the thing is, you do have to calibrate it, and you don't actually have to plug it into your trailer for it to calibrate. It's just simple driving around, but you do want to make sure that it's calibrated before hooking up to your trailer and just hitting the road. But really the best way to do the calibration is just normal driving. But if you want to speed up that process, if you're hooking up to your trailer and need to use it right away, you can kind of get up to speed and then just hit the brakes, and then you can continue that process. Now the best way to check that too is if you are hooked up to a 7-way, you're going to see the lights blinking green and blue, and that means that it's actively calibrating. And once you have it stopped enough times to where it's completely calibrated, it should become a solid blue. And that was a look and installation of the Redarc brake controller on a 2017 Cadillac Escalade.